There are moments in MotoGP when the stopwatch becomes irrelevant, when a garage filled with metal and data suddenly feels like a place haunted by something alive, and this season Ducati discovered exactly that. It began with a whisper no one should have heard and ended with a crash no one can forget. A trajectory so improbable it forced engineers, riders, and rivals to question whether Marc Márquez was shaping the GP25 or if the machine had been waiting for him all along. While Pecco Bagnaia refined perfection with the patience of a craftsman, Marc moved through the box like a coded signal disrupting every assumption, bending telemetry to sensations no human should possess. His touch altered the motorcycle's pulse. His absence altered the team's breathing. And when the reigning champion fell in Indonesia, the paddock didn't ask if Ducati would recover. They asked if the sport itself could return to equilibrium. Because behind every chart, behind every silent stare in the garage, lingers the same unsettling doubt. What happens when a rider who redefined the rules suddenly becomes the one element no data model can predict? The answer is the story Ducati never wanted to tell, one where leadership isn't imposed, but awakened, and where a dynasty built around a phenomenon may now face its most fragile truth. Marco Rigamonti lowered his voice as if afraid the walls might remember, and the whisper he released carried the weight of a revelation too sharp to name. He said, "Con Marc non capisci I si stai guardando un pilota o un fenomeno," and the words drifted through the paddock like a fuse that no one saw but everyone felt. Mechanics froze for a heartbeat, sensing an unseen shift in the center of gravity around the red garage. The inner monologue of Marquez echoed elsewhere. Why does their silence feel heavier than my speed? As if he, too, sensed the tremor. Rigamonti studied the telemetry that showed an anomalous 0.03-second stabilization delay in the throttle body, a detail so small it felt like a secret. The air in the box thickened, pulsing with the unease of a room suddenly aware of its own heartbeat. Journalists tried to decode the mood, but the atmosphere behaved like a compass spinning without north. The metaphor that emerged was simple. Marc wasn't entering the team. He was bending its light like a prism caught by accident. Engineers exchanged glances that revealed a mixture of awe and fear. A mechanic whispered that Marc's presence felt like a draft from a door no one remembered opening. Rigamonti sensed that mystery growing, the subtle pressure behind every movement. Ducati, long accustomed to order, now vibrated with an unpredictable electricity. Even Bagnaia noticed conversations shortening when Marc approached. The garage seemed to inhale when he stepped inside and exhale only after he left. Rumors swirled that the GP25 responded to him with an obedience bordering on eerie. Marc felt eyes on him, yet none hostile, just searching. The tension built slowly, like ink spreading across dry paper. Rigamonti realized too late that he had spoken a truth larger than intended. And the climax arrived when he murmured to himself that some whispers don't fade. They detonate in silence. Marc's absence from the saddle should have left a void. Yet Rigamonti noticed that the garage moved as if guided by an invisible tide, and he confessed that Marc's leadership, non commando risveglia. Engineers leaned closer to their screens with a sharper focus, sensing a current they couldn't explain. A mechanic muttered that even the cable seemed more obedient when Marc watched. Inside his hospital room, Marc wondered, how can I still shape a room I'm not inside? The GP25 data revealed an obscure parameter, an 8% reduction in chassis flex oscillation during his tests that technicians studied like scripture. Bagnaia maintained his precise routines, but his orderliness now felt like a lighthouse dimming at dawn. The contrast unsettled the team because one leadership was learned and the other radiated. Rigamonti observed this shift with the unease of someone witnessing gravity realign. Conversations in the garage shortened when Marc's name appeared on a monitor. Even silence behaved differently near his presence. The metaphor that rose unbidden was that Marc was not a flame, but the oxygen that made every spark burn brighter. Technicians drifted toward his methods with an instinct they couldn't rationalize. Bagnaia felt the air tighten around him, a quiet pressure that never announced itself. The hierarchy, once linear, now pulsed like a living organism, rediscovering its heartbeat. Every briefing reminded Rigamonti that charisma can be a form of engineering. Even injured, Marc shaped decisions with the precision of a sculptor touching marble from afar. Ducati's workflow evolved into something more fluid, as if time itself bent to accommodate him. Rigamonti feared that such influence was both a blessing and a dangerous dependency. The climax struck when he whispered that true leadership doesn't lead. It transforms those who follow, leaving nothing unchanged. Marc's first laps on the GP25 shattered every expectation as if the bike were welcoming back an old companion, rather than meeting a new master, and Rigamonti admitted, "Non ho mai visto nulla di simile." The telemetry graph stunned the technicians by revealing that Marc used only 11% of microcorrections in direction changes, a value normally achieved after months of adaptation. His inner thought flickered beneath the helmet. Why does this feel like it already knows me? As if rider and machine shared an unspoken memory. A hidden parameter in the data, the lean synchronization delay, dropped to 0.07 seconds, signaling a harmony engineers struggled to explain. The garage observed in a hush that felt almost reverent. Bagnaia's technicians exchanged looks that carried both respect and unease. Mechanics whispered that the GP25 didn't simply respond to him, it leaned toward him. The metaphor forming in everyone's mind was that the bike behaved like wet clay shaped by hands that never touched it. Rigamonti circled the machine as though inspecting a creature evolving under its own will. Marc's movements seemed to rewrite the bike's instincts rather than adjust to them. Even the throttle response curve shifted subtly after each run, adapting with uncanny fluidity. Journalists sensed the tension brewing but lacked the vocabulary to describe it. Ducati's veterans murmured that such natural compatibility bordered on myth. The engineers attempted to simulate his riding patterns, yet algorithms failed to replicate his organic precision. Marc felt a pulse in the handlebars like a greeting, unsettling him in ways he couldn't articulate. Rigamonti's voice trembled when he said the bike behaved as if it were remembering him, not learning him. The garage's atmosphere thickened with the weight of an unprecedented revelation. Every lap chipped away at the certainty of technical dogma. And the climax arrived when a mechanic whispered that if this was only the beginning, then the sport had just witnessed the birth of something no system could contain. Ducati discovered the danger of abundance when two different forms of light began burning under the same roof, and Rigamonti murmured, "Che dentro si sono due soli," aware that no structure is built to withstand such heat. Bagnaia moved through the garage with his usual measured precision, each gesture aligned like gears in a clock. Marquez, instead, entered a room and bent its rhythm without speaking. Inside his helmet, he wondered, how do you coexist with someone whose shadow follows you even before he arrives? A rarely monitored parameter, the traction modulation drift, shifted by 4% only when Marc rode, a detail that fascinated the engineers. Technicians found themselves splitting unconsciously into two currents, one craving Pecco's order, the other seduced by Marc's volatility. The duality reshaped conversations, pauses, even the tempo of footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. Rigamonti sensed the tension thickening like resin catching dust. Bagnaia's leadership resembled a compass, steady and reassuring, yet Marc's influence spread like sunlight refracting through a cracked window, unpredictable but mesmerizing. A mechanic confessed he adjusted tire pressure differently depending on which rider approached. The air around the garage felt stretched, as if holding its breath between two contradictory truths. Engineers argued over setups without realizing they were defending philosophies. The GP25 seemed to carry two personalities in its data, mirroring its riders. Journalists noticed the silence after certain exchanges and wrote notes they didn't dare print. The metaphor became impossible to ignore. The garage was a sky too small for twin suns, each altering the gravity of the other. Marc thrived in this storm, feeding on its raw edges. Pecco endured it, sharpening his discipline like a solitary ritual. Ducati felt itself leaning, imperceptibly but steadily, toward the brighter, more dangerous star. And the climax settled when Rigamonti whispered that rivalries born in the same home do not fade. They burn until something finally gives. The technical rift between Marc and Pecco emerged first as a whisper in the data logs, and Rigamonti admitted, not a question di tempi, a question di vision, sensing a fracture that numbers alone couldn't contain. Marc requested a pivot frame modification after just 2 days, a demand so immediate it felt like instinct masquerading as engineering. Bagnaia, faithful to his methodical cadence, proposed the same adjustment only after a month of measured observation. Inside his helmet, Marc wondered, why wait for certainty when the bike is already speaking? A forgotten parameter resurfaced in the analysis, a 1.4 degrees torsional deviation under heavy braking that Marc had perceived before instruments confirmed it. The garage became a terrain of silent comparisons, each decision echoing louder than intended. Technicians noticed their own habits shifting, depending on whose data lay open on the screen. The metaphor forming in the background was simple. Two cartographers were drawing the same map with different compasses. Rigamonti watched as meetings stretched longer, burdened by invisible loyalties. Pecco defended structure as though it were oxygen. Marc attacked evolution like someone chasing an echo only he could hear. Ducati's veterans debated whether speed of adaptation or depth of analysis defined progress. Even the GP25's idle pitch changed subtly during warm-ups, as if absorbing the tension. Engineers found themselves adjusting the chain slack more carefully after Marc's runs. Conversations became precise, clipped, almost surgical. Journalists sensed the undercurrent but lacked the vocabulary to expose it. Ducati felt torn between the reliability of order and the seduction of chaos. Marc's energy pushed the team toward risk. Pecco's restraint pulled them toward method. And the climax crystallized when Rigamonti whispered that this wasn't development anymore. It was a slow-motion war deciding the shape of Ducati's future. Rigamonti observed Marc in the dim light of the garage and whispered, "Un mostro del controllo," knowing the phrase captured only a fraction of his terrifying precision. Technicians watched him ride with the disbelief of men, witnessing a law being rewritten in real time. Marc felt the front tire hum beneath him and wondered, why do I sense the bike's thoughts before it speaks? A hidden metric, the microload delta, revealed he could perceive front-load variations below 2 kilograms, a threshold previously considered undetectable by humans. His mind processed the circuit like an engineer drafting schematics in motion. His body, however, reacted with an instinct that bordered on feral grace. The duality unsettled even the most seasoned mechanics. Bagnaia's crew admitted privately that Marc's inputs frightened them in their accuracy. His braking zones looked drawn with a compass, yet entered with a heartbeat's violence. The metaphor around the paddock became undeniable. He was not riding the GP25, he was tuning it like a violin that answered only to him. Engineers noticed he anticipated telemetry trends 3 corners before sensors captured them. Meetings grew tense as his feedback arrived faster than their models could absorb. Rigamonti confessed he sometimes struggled to translate Marc's sensations into language. The bike's chassis resonance decreased by 6% during his runs, a change attributed to unquantifiable synergy. Marc walked through the garage with quiet steps that felt louder than any engine rev. Technicians leaned in unconsciously whenever he spoke. Caught by gravity, they couldn't resist. His ability to merge calculation with eruption made him both a blueprint and a storm. Journalists sensed that describing him required a new vocabulary. The team realized they were dealing with something beyond talent, beyond training, beyond precedent. And the climax arrived when Rigamonti admitted that Marc wasn't just a rider, he was a total weapon forged in silence. Rigamonti realized the Marquez Effect the moment Ducati's engineering meetings stopped resembling blueprints and began moving like living organisms, and he admitted, "Dobbiamo ricalibrarsi eterno a lui." Marc's arrival dissolved long-standing procedures with the quiet inevitability of a tide reshaping a shoreline. The team discovered that his feedback anticipated data by minutes, sometimes hours, forcing them to rethink how analysis should begin. Inside his mind, Marc wondered, if the bike evolves with me, why shouldn't the team learn to breathe differently too? A once-ignored parameter, anticipatory torque ripple reading, became central to development because Marc sensed fluctuations before any chart displayed them. Engineers accustomed to rigid workflows found themselves improvising with unprecedented confidence. The atmosphere in the garage shifted, vibrating like glass touched by a distant melody. Decisions accelerated as if time itself had been rewired. Bagnaia's structured influence remained, but it felt increasingly archival compared to Marc's fluidity. A mechanic confessed he adjusted the rear set angles with a new boldness whenever Marc stepped near. The metaphor whispered among technicians said it best. Marc was not an ingredient in the recipe. He was the new taste altering every dish. Ducati's vocabulary changed, adopting terms born from Marc's sensations rather than laboratory definitions. The GP25 setup sheets grew more elastic, welcoming instinct where formulas once ruled. Engineers debated less and adapted more, unsure whether they were choosing or being carried. Even the simulation software was updated to model variables that didn't exist before his feedback. Rigamonti felt equal wonder and fear as tradition bowed to intuition. Marc sensed the shift and carried it lightly, as though evolution were simply breathing. Ducati, without admitting it, rebuilt its identity around him. And the climax settled when Rigamonti whispered that sometimes a rider doesn't fit into a system, he becomes the system that everyone else must follow. The moment Marc hit the asphalt in Indonesia, time folded in on itself, and Rigamonti whispered, "Il silenzio fa più rumore della caduta," realizing the world had stopped around a single impact. Ducati's screens froze on the frame that revealed the GP25's failure to absorb a sudden load variation, a 12-millisecond anomaly that now felt like a fracture in destiny. Marc lay in a hospital wondering, can a story keep running if the body pauses? Technicians moved through the garage like people afraid to touch a memory. The title he had just secured seemed suddenly weightless. Bagnaia sensed an opening shaped more like a wound than an opportunity. Engineers stared at the suspension data as though it were a confession. The atmosphere thickened into a tension that clung to every breath. Ducati realized they had built their future around a rider, now suspended in uncertainty. The metaphor whispered through the paddock said it clearly. The dynasty was a cathedral whose largest pillar had cracked overnight. Rigamonti felt the garage trembling in its foundations. Mechanics worked with the reverence of people tending to a relic. Every conversation ended prematurely, as if afraid of naming the truth. Marc's telemetry from the previous race played back like a heartbeat that no longer synced with the present. Bagnaia polished his gloves in a corner, aware the power map of the team was shifting beneath him. Ducati's leaders debated whether adapting meant survival or betrayal. The GP25 sat under the lights like a creature waiting for the return of its keeper. Even the temperature of the box felt altered, colder, unsettled. Engineers feared that replacing Marc's instincts was impossible. And the climax struck when Rigamonti murmured that legends are measured not by triumphs, but by what remains standing when they fall.